Hello everyone, and welcome to this new educational chess game. I have the white pieces, and I'm going to start with the knight to f3, which is known as the Reti opening. It's a fairly flexible opening that gives me a wide range of options for using the c2, d2, and e2 pawns, the main pawns that will fight for the center. My opponent responds with g6. He is rated 1797. He wants to put his bishop on g7 on the longest dark square diagonal of the board, but I'm going to hinder him with the pawn to d4. We're playing a 50-minute game. Be careful, there's no increment. He plays the pawn to d6, and I'm going to play the pawn to c4. I could have also played the pawn to e4, but I like playing these three pawns, c4, d4, and e4. And so since he lets me play e4, I play e4. He plays knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4, knight to c3 to defend. And he's already able to castle kingside, but he plays c6. In this position, I simply have a space advantage. Behind the c file, g3 squares against 2, behind the d file, g3 squares against 2, and behind the o file, g3 squares against only 1. So he's going to adopt a slower development style. That will give me more options to better place my pieces. I'm going to play bishop e2. Careful, I'm not playing bishop to d3. Because the pawn on d4 is a pawn that can be targeted by the bishop and sometimes by the c5 or e5 pushes, followed by knight to c6. And on top of that, it avoids pins with bishop to g4. He castles kingside, I'll castle as well, and he plays a6. So, as you can see, he's taking a very defensive approach here. He's waiting to see what I'm going to do, he's trying to control the squares, but in the end, he's only playing on 3 ranks, whereas I'm already on the 4th rank, I have an extra rank. I'm used to playing queen to c2 in this type of position. It protects the pawn on e4 and frees up the d1 square for my rook, so it can line up with his queen, so queen to c2. Once I play rook to d1, he can no longer play the c5 or e5 pushes in the same way, because I could capture and his pawn wouldn't be able to recapture due to the rook and queen being lined up. He plays knight to d7, so I play rook to d1. If he plays e5, I take. If he recaptures with the pawn, I recapture. And if he recaptures with the knight, I take his queen. That means the e5 push will cost him material. He can't play the e5 push. So often players play queen to c7 to get out of the alignment with the rook. There will be a queen facing queen alignment, so you have to be careful because even if they're separated by pieces, the influence of a piece doesn't stop at the first obstacle it encounters. You really have to look further along the line because sometimes there are combinations that can open up the position. He plays queen to e8. That's more surprising. Usually players prefer to play queen to c7. He plays queen to e8 to support the e5 push. So I look at the e5 push myself. I try to take the initiative. On pawn takes. His knight is attacked, so most likely he'll come to g4 to triple the pressure on my pawn on e5. But here, I play e6, forcing the issue. I attack his knight and his pawn on f7, so he'll almost certainly have to take on e6. I give up a pawn, but I ruin his pawn structure. This is what's called a knight attack, so I'm going to play e5. Look, take, knight to g4, e6, capture. He has doubled pawns, isolated, and his king is exposed. And often, you play knight to g5 to attack the pawn on e6. He'll probably have to play knight to d7 so the bishop can defend. But this push to e5 is very destabilizing for him and destructive since I'm going to break his pawn structure. That's the danger for black when playing on 3 ranks and giving me an extra rank. It means I have a strong pawn center, and at some point, my pawns can go on the attack. So let me continue. If the knight comes to h5, I can play g4. His knight has no squares. If it comes to f4, the bishop takes. That loses a piece. You don't really want to play the g-pawn, which is supposed to defend the king, but if it wins a piece, it's worth considering. So, knight to g4, there you go. And you see, he's attacking my pawn 3 times. I can't defend it. I'm only defending it once. I can't suddenly find a miracle move to defend it 2 more times. So I play e6. Pawn takes. In my opinion, he's going to take. He could also play knight to f6 maybe, but that doesn't change the fact that I would trade the e-pawn for the f-pawn. So I would create an isolated pawn and a weakness around his king. Now after the move knight to g5, he might want to take on f2. Because I wouldn't be able to play bishop takes knight, otherwise he would take my queen. That's interesting, you see. Knight to g5, rook takes on f2. But I have the move h3. I attack his knight, and if his knight moves, I take his rook. So after knight to g5, what is he going to do? His knight is under attack, and so is his pawn on e6. So after knight to g5, he will likely play knight to f6 to protect his knight and his pawn. After knight to g5, I also need to consider knight takes on f2. That attacks my rook. But after knight to g5, knight takes on f2, I can play rook to f1. And his knight has no retreat square. He won't be able to go back to g4, the bishop will catch him. So I'm actually not afraid of captures on f2. I can still play knight to g5. I'm going to play knight to g5. I'm attacking e6. I'm attacking his knight. I'm not afraid of either knight takes f2 or rook takes f2, as I explained to you. So he's going to play knight to f6. Knight to e5. I don't think so. Because if I come to attack with f4 without the knight and he moves, I'll then win the knight on g4. So I think he only has knight to f6. I'm down a pawn, but I think I have a better pawn structure. This pawn sacrifice from e5 to e6 is called the knight attack. So why is it called that? Because there's a famous game where this pawn sacrifice ended up trapping the opponent's pieces. That's not the case here, but in that game it trapped the opponent's pieces so they couldn't do anything. And so it was called the knight attack because the pieces would fall asleep, they simply couldn't play, so knight to f6 was played. If I play h3, the knight can go back to h6 and then return to f5. The problem is he's going to play h6 against me. I would need to be able to attack e6 one more time, but I can't play queen to e4 because the knight would take it. Here I play bishop takes, knight takes, and then queen to e4. This time he can play knight takes f2 and attack both my queen and my rook. Even if I play queen to h4 to attack h7, he can still play h6. Here, I'm thinking about knight to e4, maybe with the idea of coming to c5. But if I play knight to e4, he's going to play h6 anyway. My knight doesn't have many squares. You see, b5 and d5 are blocked. It's the e4 square that I need to try to use. But then, after h6, I'd rather retreat my knight from g5 to e4. Or maybe not. Perhaps I'll need to come back to f3 to use the e5 square once I've chased away his knight from g4. So here, I don't know, I'll need to think about it a bit. With h3, what's good is that after knight to h6, he won't be able to play h6 against me. And after h3, knight to e5, maybe I can attack his knight. The f4 push or bishop to f4 could be interesting. I'm going to play h3. After all, his knight is the only piece really active, but it's easy to unsettle. There we go. Knight to h6 has been played. Now, that gives me a bit of time to attack e6. c5 with the idea of bishop to c4. I don't believe in it because he can play knight to d5 to block. On the other hand, moving the bishop gives me the e1 square, the file, opening the file to attack e6. I still think my knight needs to be improved, but if I play knight to e4, he can take queen takes, and that lets me attack e6. That's interesting. And if I play knight to e4 and he doesn't take, then knight to c5 afterwards, and I double up the attacks on e6. So I'm really tempted to play knight to e4. Now the question is, should I move the bishop to open the file and attack e6? Or should I play knight to e4 with the idea of knight to c5? Knight to e4, if he plays b6 for example, I won't have the c5 square, so what will my knight do? Maybe I need to consider other options. Knight to a4 is better than knight to e4. I'm threatening to get to c5, but I can also go to b6. And above all, he can't play b6 because I'll capture. And if knight to a5, then b6, I attack the rook, rook to b8. I can also try to take the light squared bishop to weaken the defense of e6. Knight to a4, the knight on the edge. Usually you don't play the knight on the edge, unless it can bounce back and return to the game. And that's what I'm going to do with the b6 and c5 squares, which are much better than c3, where the knight was actually blocked by the pawns on c6 and e6. As for my dark squared bishop, I'm still not quite sure what to do with it. But for example, if I play knight to b6 and rook to b8, I have bishop to f4 and his rook is trapped. And if knight to b6 and rook to a7, I have bishop to e3, lining up the pieces, or even bishop to f4 with the threat of bishop to b8 to trap his rook. So here, I'm going to try to get into the weak dark squares on the queen side, like b6 and c7, you see, with the diagonal and the bishop's line. He plays e5. That will hinder my ideas of playing bishop f4. So knight to b6 or knight to c5 anyway. Because with knight to c5, if I play knight to e6, bishop takes, knight takes, rook to f7, I can take his dark squared bishop or play knight to c7 for the fork. So I'm going to play knight to c5. On b6, knight to e6, bishop takes, knight takes, rook to f7, fork on c7, or I get rid of his dark squared bishop because he's very weak on the dark squares. He plays e6. I hadn't thought of that. On the other hand, the bishop is really buried. That might give me some ideas with knight to d4. I have a knight outpost to get into d6 afterwards. Especially since after knight to d4, for example, knight takes, I can push c5 to get into d6. I can even come back to c4 and then get into b6 afterwards. This is going to be very interesting. So which knight? The knight on c5 or the knight on g5? If I play knight g5 to e4, he can play b6. So I'll play knight c5 to e4. In my opinion, he'll take knight recaptures, and I try to block his doubled and isolated pawns. But he can try to get back into the game. You know, knight f5, knight d4. That would be very annoying. Because if I have the d6 square with c5 and knight to d6, he can still come back with knight to f5 and knight to d4. In fact, he does it right away to defend d6, and after the g4 push, he'll settle on d4. That's very annoying. And now he's actually preparing h6. With h6, I can come back to f3, attack e5, and defend d4. I'll play bishop to e3, and if knight goes to d4, bishop takes, pawn takes, rook takes. But I have to be careful. If his knight moves, his bishop will attack my rook. After bishop to e3, he could play knight takes, and then we both take as well. But I'm not afraid of that. All right, I'll play bishop to e3. I'm defending the d4 square and maybe preparing the g4 push. Getting rid of that knight so I can get into d6 afterwards. This game is really a positional battle. The problem is there's no increment, no added time, and I have 3 times less time. He plays h6, so now knight to f3. If knight takes, I have queen takes, fortunately. And now I'm attacking e5. I'm attacking e5 twice. I'm still a pawn down, but I control the position, especially on the up file. Look at the up file. There are 2 bishops, a queen, 2 pawns, and another queen. It's incredible, the play on the up file. But what's interesting here is that these 2 bishops are restricted. Now he takes, and I'm hesitating between recapturing with the queen or with the pawn, but I'll probably recapture with the queen. That puts pressure on h6 to block his bishop. But when I recapture with the queen, he'll play e4 so that I take, and he can free up with bishop takes b2. Recapturing with the pawn also allows me to control the f4 square to prevent rook to f4. I'll recapture with the pawn to maintain the blockade on e5 so he can't play e4, get rid of that pawn, try to strike back on b2, and open up the long diagonal. I need to bury these 2 bishops. You see, the e6 pawn blocks the c8 bishop, and the e5 pawn blocks the g7 bishop. There are pressures, double pressure on e5, pressure on g6, which forces the pieces to defend. My light squared bishop isn't active, but now I can play c5 and bishop to c4 so it can get into the game that way. Or bishop to d3 for that matter. Attack g6, king to h7, and maybe afterwards h4, h5, or knight to h4. That's even faster. Bishop to d3, king to h7, knight to h4, and I capture the g6 pawn. He plays queen to f7. So here, if I take on e5, he'll try to get into f2 to take revenge on the bishop, right? That's why bishop to d3 is very good. Bishop to d3. I have to bring the fight to the light squares, because I don't have a dark squared bishop. On the other hand, I have an extra piece to fight on the light squares, since my knight can fight on the light squares. That's why it's important to attack g6. If I play g5, queen to h7 is checkmate, he's giving me the light squares. So, he'll probably play king to h7. No, he plays queen to f5. That's a better move, of course. If I take, it fixes his whole structure, so I won't take. Here, I'm looking at knight to h4. Queen takes, bishop takes. The g6 pawn is under attack, so he might play g5. I can go into g6, attack his rook, but his rook can move. In any case, I shouldn't take. Do I have another interesting move? I can move my queen, maybe queen to h4. What does that do? I free the bishop, it attacks his queen and his g6 pawn. Queen to h4. He might play queen to h5. Queen takes, pawn takes, bishop to e4, and I still block him, right? No, I don't want to open up the position for him. Knight to h4, he'll play queen to f2 check. I move aside, and he has nothing. He has no follow-up, so knight to h4. Now we're going to play an endgame. I don't have much time, but we're going to play an endgame where I'll try to paralyze his position. There we go. For now, he has no way in. He can play g5, that's true, but that just traps his dark squared bishop. He plays rook to b8. I'm going to play c5 to block the b pawn. Well, he can play b6, but that will weaken c6. He can move the rook to try to play bishop and escape. I'll need to reinforce with b4. But as soon as he plays bishop and escapes, he'll lose the e5 pawn. That's good news for me. But I really don't have much time left, so I have to play as fast as possible now. There's no other choice. Let's hope he also starts playing quickly to try to make me run out of time and that he makes a big mistake. So I play b4 and then take on c6, but I could have taken on c6 right away. The problem with playing very fast is that I also miss some moves. The d6 square is interesting. Now he's going to crack, he's going to lose material. I'm attacking e6, I'm attacking c6. But e6, I don't care, I want c6. He's going to go protect c6? No, he's not protecting c6. Oh, right, because he wants to play bishop and escape. Bishop and escape, I go into d7. Let's try to play bishop and escape. Check. No, he's defending. Now I go into d6. If he comes to f8, maybe there's d takes e5, bishop to h7, knight to g6. We'll try to checkmate him like that. We're going to give him a rook, but to coordinate rook, bishop, and knight against his king, that's running out of squares. He resigns. So he was very fair play because he resigned. He could have tried to flag me, but it's true that he's completely paralyzed. And here, my idea is the following. You see, if I play bishop and escape, I take on e5. I let him take the bishop because after that, there's bishop to h7 check. And if he goes to h8, knight to g6 is mate. That's what I wanted to do. Mate on a white square, by the way. Look, all my pieces are on white squares. And if he goes to f8, I have knight to g6 mate, or even rook to f7 mate. So that was my idea. I tell myself, he can't move his rook because he'll lose the bishop. If I move this rook, he loses the pawn on e6. I'm attacking the pawn on c6 twice. What he sees is that he's going to lose the c6 pawn. For example, if he plays rook to c8, he'll lose e6, and if he doesn't play rook to c8, he'll lose c6. So he tells himself he's bound to lose a pawn. He resigns because of this, but in reality, it's not the pawn I was after. It's checkmate. My idea is that after bishop and escape, even if he attacks the rook, I take on e5. That allows me to have threats like bishop to h7, king to h8, knight to g6, checkmate. Even if he takes my rook, I don't take back, you see? Bishop to h7, king to f8, knight to g6, or king to h8, knight to g6, or if king to f8, rook to f7. And you'll see that each time, the pieces land on the white squares to deliver mate, because his dark squared bishop wasn't able to defend the white squares. It's a very beautiful positional game that led to the complete congestion of the opponent. And look, the doubled isolated pawns, that's the pawn I gave him with the knight attack, ended up burying his bishops. The pawn on c6 buries the bishop, and the pawn on e5 buries the bishop on g7. And even if the bishop came to c8, it would be buried by the pawn on e6. By the way, if the bishop comes to c8 here, we haven't talked about this move, maybe simply rook to a7, and the pawn on c6 will fall anyway. But in that position, he still could have played. I probably would have lost just the same if he had tried to hold on to the pawn. On the other hand, if I play bishop and escape, I had mate. I was just telling you that. I had mate there. Knight to e5, then bishop to h7, and knight to g6. So the computer gives me 89% accuracy versus 85. And yet, I thought I had played a very nice positional game. But why is my score still quite low? Because in reality, I made a very critical mistake. I'll show it to you. In that position, I played knight to f3, g6, d4. The critical mistake happens in the opening. d6, pawn to c4, bishop g7, pawn to e4, knight to f6, knight to c3, peon c6, bishop e2, short castle, pawn to a6, queen to c2, knight to d7, rook to d1, queen to e8, and e5. And my mistake is about to happen. Takes on e5, takes on e5, knight to g4, e6, takes on e6, and here I play knight to g5, and I told you I wasn't afraid of captures on f2, but there's a move I didn't see. The computer tells me that actually I should have played h3 to push the knight back and only then come to g5. Which is more or less what happened in the game, in the end. Except that I went to g5 right away and there he could have taken on f2. But not with the rook, of course, because there's h3. His knight is attacked and so is his rook. He's going to lose material. On the other hand, he could have taken with the knight. And I told you that's not good. I play rook to f1 and his knight has no squares. But look, it's brilliant. He could have played knight to g4, and if I take his knight, what happens then? What do black do to me? Do you see the move? So now, the move. It's obvious to see. But the problem is, it was much less easy to spot beforehand. It's bishop to d4, a terrible check. If I go to h1, everything gets taken and it's mate. And if I go to f2, well, he takes twice. That means after knight takes f2, rook to f1, knight to g4, that's the position. You absolutely must not take his knight. The computer recommends playing queen to d1, but that's the position from the game. Except that I've lost the pawn on f2, which is going to give him a lot more counterplay. So my plan isn't bad. It's just that I shouldn't go to g5 right away. I need to play h3, knight to h6, and now I play knight to g5. And here, do you see what the computer says? Even though I've given up a pawn, it still gives me a considerable advantage. I've given a pawn to my opponent, but it gives me a considerable advantage because my opponent's structure is compromised. And as you saw, the bishops had a hard time playing. In the end, the name knight attack is fitting, because these pieces, especially the bishops, ended up being put to sleep in the game. You can see, especially in this position, where I'm still down a pawn. But look at the computer evaluation. It gives me a considerable advantage because the bishop on g7 can't move, and neither can the bishop on c8. It's true that the rooks can try to fight on the d file, but even then, I'm the one who controls the file. But my knight can maneuver and try to improve its position. On the other hand, his bishops can't. I hope you enjoyed this very positional game. I had a lot of fun. I was very enthusiastic. Of course, you can leave me likes, comments, help the channel support it, and share the video. Alright, see you soon.